Okay. Well, thank you for joining us this evening, both here in the church and online. And for those of you who are in the church, the slides are here, beautifully reproduced, I must say, quite nicely done. And over the next 3 weeks, be looking at this idea of the meeting place, Christianity and culture in early Toronto. Just for a point of clarification, when we talk about early Toronto, I am using what is called the long 19th century as the period that covers that. For historians, the long 19th century covers the period from 1792 to 1914, which is why it's called the long 19th century. But it fits perfectly with the beginnings, really, of Toronto as we know it. So at that, when you go past the title page there to the first slide of that lovely hillside, if you were to look at Toronto's skyline today, it's hard to imagine a time when that hilly terrain overlooking Lake Ontario was covered in dense forest, but of course it was. Long before the Europeans arrived, it had been home for thousands of years, as we all now know, to the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. And they had lived, hunted, traded, and had their own deeply spiritual traditions right here in this area. Children of the Creator whose hand was evident in every aspect of the universe that they saw around them. A spirituality that we Christians are only now just starting to appreciate and learn from. Now, sadly, I think we also are very well aware, too well aware sometimes, that almost everything changed to the detriment of those ancient peoples when the first European traders and missionaries arrived in this area in the 17th century, in this area that we now call Toronto. But before we get into the Christian history of this city, however, we have to spend a little bit of time with the vexed question of its name, Toronto. Now, if you look at that next slide, the fact is that the earliest surviving map that records what might be Toronto comes from about the year 1650. And it was made by a French priest named Father René de Bréhan de Galinée, on which you can see he records the name Lac de Toronto. That's the good news. The bad news, when you look at it, is that you'll realize that Galinée has clearly marked it on what we would today call Lake Simcoe. Now, if you look to the next slide, that might help explain it. As for the meaning then of Toronto, scholars over the centuries have tried to figure out the meaning of that name, but all their best efforts notwithstanding, we are still not 100% sure. The most likely translation we think is, as that slide will show you, the place where there are trees in the water. That is probably what Toronto means. Likely we're referring to a weir that had been set up to catch fish from time immemorial in the passage between Lake Simcoe and Lake Couchiching. So how then did the name Toronto migrate from up on Lake Simcoe down to this city by Lake Ontario? Well, not surprisingly, that appears to have been the result of error, scribal error, as people copied maps by hand with the mistaken assignment of Toronto to the shores of Lake Ontario, and the name just stuck. That's what scholars currently think. But what the word Toronto probably did not mean was meeting place, despite the fact that that is what the school books have been saying to us since the 19th century. Honest attempts to decipher the word by very well-intentioned scholars, especially in the late 19th century, but who had an insufficient grasp of the native languages, led to that error. And yet, there is a beauty to the mistake, since Toronto really has become a meeting place and one of the most culturally diverse cities on the planet. So I'm going to stand by the name, at least for the purposes of this series, even though it's not a faithful translation at all. I believe, however, that it is probably the most appropriate of all of Toronto's nicknames, of which, as you're probably aware, there are many. Muddy York, Hogtown, the Queen City, Toronto the Good, and the City of Churches, to name but a few. Now, if we move on to the next image there, one of the things that absolutely we must not do when considering any aspect of Canadian church history, including Toronto's, is to think that the American experience of our cousins to the south is normative for us just because we share the same continent and much of the same cultural legacy. The fact is that the United States has a very, very clear foundational myth that is deeply rooted in religious persecution. Canada's is not. The arrival of Puritans, the religious refugees from Great Britain and then others from the continent in search of freedom of worship, that's an American story. Generally speaking, it is not ours. Persecuted religious minorities certainly would arrive here in Canada, but not during its foundational period. Now, if we move on to the next image, by contrast with the United States, Canada's colonial beginnings and settlement are rooted in trade, especially in the expansion of imperial trade, whether it was French or British or Portuguese for that matter. Ours in this country is an economic origin. And the Catholics and Protestants who came to this area from the 17th through the 19th century, they came here to be part of that economic enterprise, not to escape religious persecution. Our story is different from the Americans. That's an important fact to keep in mind if we want to understand how a diverse Christian community evolved in this very city and so very, very quickly, especially over the course of the 19th century. So moving on again now. The first known European settlement in what is now Toronto actually was not far from where we are sitting right now. Some of you probably were aware of that. Several French outposts were established in the early 18th century in what is now the Bobby Point area, not far north from here, just off of Jane, which sits about 400 feet above the lake and had a perfect vantage point for observing and intercepting native traders who were coming down the Humber River with their goods. By 1750, and then for about the next 10 years until the fall of Quebec in 1759, there was another fort, Fort Rouillé, that sat on what is today the site of the Canadian National Exhibition, and you can see the memorial to that if you go down there. French soldiers there also kept watch, and they observed the comings and goings on the lake, intercepting native trade that was bound for their English enemies who were situated on the other side at Oswego, New York. Now, it's almost certainly during this particular period, 1750, 1760, that the very first Christian ceremonies would have been celebrated in what would become Toronto, since we know that a French Catholic priest used to come from Niagara on a semi-regular basis to attend to the spiritual needs of the soldiers stationed here. So confessions would have been heard, Mass would have been celebrated, that sort of thing. That's essentially the beginning of Christian worship in what we now call Toronto. But moving on then, any continuous history of a Christian presence in Toronto, however, begins with the arrival of the American Loyalists and with Sir John Grave Simcoe, who established York as the capital of the newly formed Upper Canada in 1793. Now, as an aside, just for simplicity's sake, for the most part, I'm going to keep talking about Toronto. But bear in mind that Simcoe, as you probably all know, renamed this place when he arrived here and called it York. And that name remained York until 1834, when the town here became a city, and then reclaimed its old native name by which it is known today so that it wouldn't be confused either with New York or with Old York. Now, Simcoe, like most of the British leaders after the American Revolution, he considered that the privileged partnership that existed between the Crown, the government of Great Britain, and the Church of England was a normal thing, and that that relationship was essential to maintaining good order in this new colony. It would never have even entered his mind to think that his government would have to pass a legal act in order to make Anglicanism the state church of Upper Canada. He just simply took it for granted, and so did everybody else that was working with him. In return, the Anglicans who had settled here, they thought it was their natural right to expect the state to provide for the legal and financial support of their church. Just made sense. That's the way it had been back in the old country. Why wouldn't it be like that here? So moving on to the next slide then. In 1791, things got really complicated. In that year, a controversial system that was known as the Clergy Reserves was created here in what would become Canada. And it said that 1/7 of all the lands belonging to the crown would belong to the Protestant clergy for their financial support in this new country. Now, as far as Simcoe and his Anglican friends were concerned, they thought that that meant that support was only intended for Anglicans and not for any other Protestant denomination. And they were starting to flood into this territory in large numbers, especially Presbyterians and Methodists. Now, not surprisingly, the Presbyterians and the Methodists, they thought the Anglicans were wrong. And as we'll see in a few moments, the Clergy Reserve, this system that was meant to provide such great financial support, became a flashpoint for mistrust between Anglicans and the other Protestants in early Toronto, despite the fact that there were actually no Clergy Reserves right here in town at all. They were outside of the town of York. So moving on, an Anglican presence was clearly established in Toronto by the year 1797, and the cathedral is indeed this year celebrating its 225th anniversary of establishment as a parish. That is the year in which the parish of St. James Church was established. The first wooden church, which you can see there, that first wooden church building, it wouldn't be ready for worship until 1807, when one was finally opened in the area where the cathedral still stands today. Now, previous to the opening of that building, as was the case in all the new settlements in Upper Canada, religious services had been held in the homes of parishioners, or in public halls, or in barns, or wherever they could find a place to hold worship. And given the shortage of clergy that was here in this new territory, more often than not, morning or evening prayer, as we just celebrated, that was what was regularly celebrated in this new territory, rather than Holy Communion. That would have been a rare luxury when a priest actually happened to be in the area. The majority of these early Toronto Anglicans were, of course, loyalists who had fled the American Revolution and chosen to settle in these newly surveyed lands on Lake Ontario's North Shore. They, however, were not alone. So you look at the next slide, Scottish Presbyterians, who had also fought for the British, they found their way here to York as well. The very first reference we have to any Presbyterian services being held here for them is in the year 1806, the year before St. James Church opens, when an American missionary by the name of Robert McDowell writes that he had visited York, and he describes in his diary as a very pleasant town, containing a large number of people, he says, some 200 miles away from his unknown home base. An actual Presbyterian church building, however, would not be erected in Toronto until 1810, and at that time, oddly enough, it was placed under the jurisdiction of the Reformed Church in Albany, New York, not a Canadian overseer at all. And McDowell had served as a minister in that church as well, because they were both obviously Calvinist in their tradition. As for the Methodists, in the next slide, they had gradually broken away from the Church of England over the course of the 18th century. By the beginning of the 19th century, Methodism was not a single church at all. They fractured really, really quickly. They were really separate faith communities with similar but different church structures and governance. Now, we don't tend to think of the Methodists very much in Canada at all today, since unlike Anglicans and Presbyterians, their name has all but disappeared from our religious landscape after they became one of the founding partners of the United Church of Canada in 1925. But the fact is that the Methodists would exert one of the greatest influences over the economic, cultural, and religious character of this city well into the 20th century. You only have to think of Timothy Eaton to understand that. That influence was already being felt, that Methodist influence, as early as the year 1794, just 1 year after Simcoe founds this town. You see in the next slide, in that year, Methodists, they had already established 2 circuit routes that covered the settlements of all of Upper Canada, with itinerant preachers who would ride from community to community, preaching the gospel and holding these incredibly lively and popular prayer meetings anywhere that they could, in people's homes and halls and barns and open fields. We know that an American Methodist minister by the name of Elijah Woolsey was the first to come here to York in 1795, laying the foundations for Methodism in the town when, as he tells us, there were fewer than 20 homes here in 1795. And certainly, there was no resident clergy by that point. I have a feeling that it was the presence of these Methodist missionaries, especially the American ones, whose meetings have become so wildly popular all through Upper Canada, but also in Lower Canada and Nova Scotia as well. I think it was the appearance of these Methodist missionaries that likely caused both the local government and the Anglican establishment here at York to up their game a bit and get a parish established sooner rather than later, because the Methodists were actually here before St. James was established. Part of the reason for this was that the Anglican community and the Anglican politicians, which is basically all of the politicians at York at that point, were on high alert for any hints of American republicanism seeping across the border and influencing our local politics. And the fact was that the Methodist preachers who were coming here, 90% of them were Americans. So having a formal Anglican presence established here in town became an urgent need, an urgent matter, not just for religion, but also for politics, even though it still took them 2 years after Reverend Woolley's visit to get St. James Parish established. Now, the one last religious group whose presence was going to have a lasting effect on the shape of our city was the Roman Catholic community. Now, after the French abandoned Toronto around 1759, there is no record of a Catholic presence here again until 1796. Now, if you look at the next slide, in that year that Father Edmund Burke, and that it's a rather odd picture. I think he's wearing a mitre, but it's a strange-looking hat that he's got on. In that year, Father Edmund Burke, he bought land for a Catholic mission in what today is Leslieville, so out on the other side of the Don River. It was very, very far removed from what was the main settlement of York, and that was probably an intentional thing. There was, of course, prejudice at that point about allowing Catholics to get established. Now, given what we know about Governor Simcoe and his prejudice towards the Church of England, it is very interesting to note that the presence of this Catholic priest in Toronto, that was actually at Simcoe's own invitation. Simcoe was a pragmatist. He feared the growing influence of American republicanism in the colony, especially among the growing number of Scottish Catholics. We don't often think of Scottish Catholics, but there were large numbers of Scottish Catholics from the Hebrides that came, and the Highlands, that came to Canada at the very, very end of the 18th century, very beginning of the 19th century. He was afraid that they might sympathize with the American Republicans. So Simcoe appealed to the Catholic Bishop of Quebec through the Governor of Canada for a Catholic priest to be sent here to York. And Burke, who was an Irishman, he was the perfect fit. From what we understand, he fiercely opposed the American Revolution, everything about it. And so he was appointed the Catholic chaplain to Fort George in Niagara, and from that place he toured around all of the western part of Upper Canada. In large part, owing to the fact that there was no priest who would reside here in York to serve the very small Catholic population, they were hopelessly neglected and the mission failed. And so at the next slide, if you look in 1806, Just before, the year before the first St. James Anglican Church was opened, the Catholic Bishop of Upper Canada, a Scotsman by the name of Alexander MacDonnell, he sold that property over in Leslieville, and he purchased a new plot of land, this time much, much closer to the town center, basically today at what is the corner of around Parliament and Queen. After a few more real estate deals by the bishop, St. Paul's, the very first Roman Catholic church, was built and opened for worship in 1822 in that neighborhood. And of course, to this day, there is a St. Paul's Catholic church that is still standing in that very area. So looking at the next slide, what I have briefly laid out for you thus far is effectively just the basic facts surrounding the settlement of only the main religious groups that over the course of time would influence the shaping of Toronto. It's nowhere near a complete list. We don't have the time for that. Baptists also arrived in the early part of the 19th century, as did smaller congregation groups like Congregationalists, Lutherans, and Quakers, and others. But what I'm hoping you're already starting to see is that Toronto, which by 1808 had an estimated population of only about 500, it was already a very, very religiously diverse place, something that would have been completely unheard of in a similarly sized town back in the British Isles, if you think about it. This was a new experience. This was an experiment in cooperation, and one of the challenges that this town would quickly face would be seeing how these different groups could work together or not to build this community. And that's why I'm not simply giving you a history of the Anglican Church in Toronto, because if I did that, too much of this city's history would be omitted. The fact is that the building of Toronto, as I've said earlier, was not a religious venture like, for example, the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts or Providence, Rhode Island. Our city was established, it grew, and it flourished because of its growing political, economic, and trading importance, not because it was a religious center. That economic engine was going to be fueled by the joint efforts of people who came from all sorts of different faith traditions, but again, their main focus was not religious. From a religious point of view, however, they all faced the same challenge, and that was this: trying to keep their spiritual traditions alive in what was clearly missionary territory and would remain that way until about the year 1850. Now, I think we all know it's not easy being missionary territory. We are almost back to that again here in the city once more. Certainly, missionary territory is not easy for the faithful who are looking for spiritual support. And most certainly it's not easy for the clergy of churches, especially Anglican and Catholic, who were used to some form of a centralized administration that would direct their activities. But that was something that was simply impossible under these new circumstances at the end of the 18th and early 19th century here in Toronto. Now, by definition, Anglicans and Catholics are episcopal in character, and that means that their churches are ultimately directed by the bishop and his council. Now, if you look at the next slide, for the earliest citizens of Toronto, that was going to be a serious problem. Why? Because their bishop, the nearest bishop, was more than 800 kilometers east from York in Quebec City, where both the Anglican and the Catholic bishops resided. There were also very few Catholic and Anglican clergy who had been licensed by their bishops to work in this part of Upper Canada. And so what was the result? Well, the result was the laity. The laity had to assume many of the most important clerical roles in this area, such as leading services in their own homes or in the homes of their neighbors. The midwives who helped the babies in their birthing, they were the ones who were doing the baptizing of children, but not always according to valid form, as we've learned. The laity, they also helped purchase property on behalf of the church for future development. And so not surprisingly, what happens is in the process is that these early colonists, they gain a sense of independence and personal responsibility for the development of their respective faith communities, something that would have been less likely and perhaps even unheard of back in England or Ireland or Scotland, where episcopal or other structures had been firmly in place for centuries that guided the direction of the churches. As the decades passed, this situation was going to lead to tension, especially between the laity and the clergy of all denominations, but especially after clergy became permanent residents here in town, and especially after the Anglican diocese was established in 1839 with a bishop resident in town, and the Roman Catholic diocese following 2 years later. So it's setting up for some difficulties between laity and the clerical element. If you look at the next slide, another challenge that both of these denominations faced in the late 18th and early 19th century surrounded something that we all take for granted now, and that is the role of that most basic structure that both Anglicans and Catholics rely upon for their organization. That is the parish. So romantically portrayed in that lovely 18th century painting you're looking at of the parish of Hampton-on-Thames, England, there was nothing like that in Upper Canada at the same time, even though there were people here. If you move on to the next, the absence of parishes as we know them, which had been the cornerstone of life back in the old country, this was going to be the church's greatest liability in this new frontier. You see, it was almost impossible to adhere to the paradigm of the parish as the center for church organization. And I don't mean just the spiritual organization, but also the charitable organization that flows from the parish. It's almost impossible when you have such a huge territory to manage and very few clergy to serve the needs of those who live on it, miles and miles away, in the Anglican context, from the corner of King and Church Street. As you can see in the slide, in 1797, there was only one Anglican parish in the Toronto area, St. James. It was at a distance of 11 miles between it and the next church that would be established in the area, St. John's, York Mills, which was founded in 1816. It would then be another 9 years until another Anglican parish would be established to the west in what became Mississauga. While the Anglican faithful in Scarborough, well, they were just going to have to wait until 1833 for a parish to be founded there. But those lands were occupied. There were farms that were already going by this time. These were huge tracts of land in which the faithful lived, but without regular spiritual care. The parish just was not real yet. If you look on to the next slide, then, this relatively inflexible nature of the traditional parish organizational model, that meant that both Anglican and Catholic communities were vulnerable to the advances of those from other faith traditions that didn't have to depend on episcopal or parish structures in order to preach the gospel. And that was especially the case back to the Methodist circuit riders. These itinerant preachers who went around on their horses with their emotional meetings that were held, from what we can understand, pretty much daily, anywhere and everywhere, were extremely popular in and around Toronto, and they began drawing people away from the churches of their birth. You can see that once we get to later censuses. Same families, religion changes every 10 years. Anglicans in particular saw them as a threat. And so this is probably as good a time to introduce one of Methodism's main opponents, the famous John Strawn. Now you can see him in the next slide. Strawn, who began life as a Scottish Presbyterian, he converted to Anglicanism and was ordained a priest by the Bishop of Quebec in 1804. Now the motives for his conversion, they're still a little unclear. But there's no doubt that conversion certainly helped him advance through the political ranks of Upper Canada once he had become an Anglican. After running a boys' school in Cornwall for about 8 years, in June of 1812, Strawn moved up here, taking up a position as the rector of York and chaplain to the military garrison that was established here. The fact was, however, he did not want to come to Toronto. If you look at the next slide, he would have preferred to have gone to Kingston instead. Nevertheless, He and his family did arrive in York just in time for the War of 1812 to start. Now, Strawn is very, very well remembered in the annals of Canadian history as the person who twice negotiated with the American forces when they occupied the town of York in the spring and in the summer of 1813. He fought hard, pressing for the protection of York's citizens and York's property. And during the second invasion, he even demanded and received back the return of some books that American soldiers had stolen during the first incursion. Moving on, the experience of the war caused Strawn to be firmly opposed to revolutionary American ideals and those who advocated for them. So you'd already had the American Revolution in 1776. The anti-Americanism had kind of died in between, and then 1812, 1813, it came back in a big, big way. And chief among the people, and at least in terms of religious people, that he was concerned about spreading these American ideals were, once again, the Methodist missionaries who were circulating around the Toronto territory. Now, the fact is that most of these circuit riders who had come before the war and had remained through the war, they were indeed Americans. And Strawn and other members of the Anglican establishment that governed Upper Canada, they were certain that these men were part responsible for the spread of the dangerous ideals that could possibly draw the colony of Upper Canada away from Britain and into the American fold through their very, very popular revival meetings. For that reason alone, Strawn lobbied to maintain the privileged position of the Church of England in Upper Canada, effectively as a state church, as a bastion of unquestionable loyalty upon which the government could rely. But Strawn did learn one very important thing from the Methodists, and that was to adapt the Methodist circuit rider system, because it was that circuit rider system that was going to help Anglicans in and around Toronto stay faithful to the church of their motherland. If you look at the next slide, in my own family, I have an example of this. According to the registers of St. James Cathedral that you're looking at there, one of my ancestors, a great aunt of some sort, was named Rachel Carefoote, who lived with her family on a farm in North Brampton. And she married a man named Joseph Chambers on the 28th of September, 1826. You can see their record in the St. James records here. Now, in my imagination, I pictured the whole family on horse and wagon, traveling the many miles to York for the wedding festivities, until the diocesan archivist disabused me of that very romantic notion. No, she said, the Anglican priests were on circuits, and they would have gone out into the hinterlands all around Toronto and supplied the necessary ceremonies for baptisms and marriages and occasional Sunday services to prevent people like the Methodists from making incursions on their people. That traditional bulky parish register, that just wasn't a luxury that was practical for a circuit rider, if you think about it, to carry around with them all over the place. And so, as you can see here, everything is just recorded on a simple page of a notebook, which is really only about this big. An Anglican circuit rider system was just going to have to do until more clergy were available and parishes could be established with all of the administrative and charitable organization that we now associate with them. The experience of the war compelled Strawn to do everything in his power, especially as a member of the executive council that governed this colony, to strengthen the Anglican position here, despite its declining membership at the beginning of the 19th century. Not surprisingly, Strawn's efforts were not popular with everyone, certainly not popular with people who were not Anglicans. If you look at the next slide, conflict initially broke out in 1823 between Strawn and the government in which he served, on the one hand, and the Presbyterians on the other, over the vexed question of who should benefit from those clergy reserves that I talked about at the beginning. As I mentioned, the assumption in the legislation was that the word Protestant, that these reserves would be there for the support of the Protestant clergy. It had just been assumed, by the Anglicans at any rate, that this referred exclusively to Anglicans. The Presbyterians in the colony, however, were now arguing that since they were the official state church of Scotland, why weren't they getting their fair share of the money from the sale of and business done on those clergy reserves for the support of their clergy and their projects, since so many Scots had flooded into Upper Canada along with the other Loyalists and after the War of 1812, and their numbers had only been increasing ever since. The Presbyterians eventually got their way, but not until 1837. The Clergy Reserves, although they amounted to more than 2 million acres, that's a huge amount of land by the mid-1830s, they really weren't much of a cash cow, at least not at the beginning, but that was beside the point. The point was the principle. The principle mattered. Who is a Protestant? Now, if you move on to the next slide, politicians, clergy, ordinary people, they began loudly voicing their opposition to what appeared to be Anglican privilege. And they opposed the Anglican family compact because almost all the members were Anglicans, which had been supporting that Anglican privilege, making the Clergy Reserves one of the main causes of the rebellion of 1837. More and more people, with every passing year, just wanted to see those reserves sold off completely to support, among other things, a broader-based public education system that would not be directed by Strawn or his Anglican colleagues. As Tory and Reform parties, governments exchanged power in the colony throughout the 1830s, the position of Strawn and his allies gradually weakened, culminating eventually in the complete secularization of those clergy reserves in 1854. And Strawn, for all of his intelligence and skill as a politician and a mover and a shaker, he foolishly overplayed his hand, leading to that very result. You see, he had initially hoped to bolster Anglican influence in Toronto and environment by taking advantage of a slight uptick in Anglican immigration to Toronto in the years 1816, 1820, that period. He was particularly keen to get the British government, through the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, to send more and more Anglican missionaries to the colony in order to be able to get out there and proselytize and secure lasting control over education, and particularly through the establishment of a university right here in Toronto. So to support that goal, Strawn, he drew up 2 charts for the government back in London to examine. One he did in 1826, the follow-up was in 1827, and they purported to show the distribution of all Christian denominations across Upper Canada. Problem was, Strawn wildly overestimated the Anglican population, and everyone knew he did it intentionally. Strawn fooled the British government, and he also managed to do the undoable. He was actually able to unite Catholics, Presbyterians, and Methodists all against him. Strawn certainly succeeded in making an enemy of the young Methodist minister Egerton Ryerson, who we all know about these days, who fervently believed in a non-sectarian public education system, and that was exactly what the colony of Upper Canada needed. Strawn, however, did achieve one of his most important goals. And if you look at the next chart, you'll see those 2 charts, 1826, 1827, convinced the British government to give a royal charter for something that was called King's College. And you can still see King's College Circle if you go down to the University of Toronto. King's College would be established in 1827, an Anglican establishment, and it would eventually become the University of Toronto. The Royal Charter, which I'm sure you can't read there very well, the Royal Charter quite clearly stipulated that all staff and council members of the college, though interestingly not the students themselves, all of those staff, council members, had to be members of the Church of England, and before they could take up their offices, they had to subscribe to the 39 Articles of Religion. To say that that didn't go over well would be an understatement. He didn't realize it at the time in 1827, but this was going to be a Pyrrhic victory for Strawn and the Anglican Church in Toronto. By 1828, the year after he got that charter, the legislative assembly that governed the colony was once again under the control of the Reform Party, who issued a scathing report stating that across the board, the vast majority of colonists in Upper Canada were now opposed to the Anglican Church for, quote, the want of a Christian discipline being exercised and a dislike to certain practices of some of her ministers. Well, we all know who they were talking about. Although unsaid, everyone knew who it was and what the practices were, specifically Strawn's interference and the interference of his fellow Anglicans in local politics. As a member of the Family Compact, which was the colony's executive branch of government, Strawn was specifically targeted by the Legislative Assembly since he was seen to be working only to benefit a very small percentage of the colony's citizens, namely the Anglicans. By now, the Methodists were the largest group in the colony. The Assembly rejected the idea that the Anglican Church should oversee public education, since it seemed to be directed towards the sole benefit of the Anglican Church to the exclusion of all others. You can see in the next slide the Methodist minister, Egerton Ryerson, who would become the father of public education in Ontario and the father of other things. Quite cleverly and successfully, Ryerson argued that privileging the Anglican Church, especially with reference to education, that was only going to strengthen republicanism in the colony, because it would reinforce the idea that there was a de facto state church, something which, of course, Republicans all reject. Giving special status to Anglicans in Toronto and throughout the colony was simply untenable by the 1830s, especially given the acts of loyalty that had been performed during the War of 1812 by members of all religious denominations present in Upper Canada at the time, including Presbyterians, Catholics, and Methodists. So one of the first battlefields then in which the Anglican political establishment in Toronto fell was on public education. If you look at the next slide, it's just a picture of a late 19th century school. In 1841, a new public school act was passed by the Upper Canadian Assembly, establishing a board of education that effectively oversaw education for the entire colony. But what it allowed was for religious minorities to operate their own schools and to receive from their municipal treasurer the proceeds from locally raised taxes to support the education of pupils, as long as they could assemble 20 kids of the same religion in the same school. That's kind of the beginnings of the two-form of education system that we are still the heirs of to this day. If you look at the next slide, because the reading of the Lord's Prayer and the memorization of the King James Bible, accompanied by a teacher's explanation, was an established part of the curriculum, the growing Roman Catholic community in Upper Canada was particularly motivated to raise funds for their own minority schools, which they did quite successfully, both in Toronto and in the surrounding areas. The various Protestant groups, they weren't as motivated to do that. Why? Because they all shared the same King James Bible. And at this point, they didn't differ significantly in its interpretation. Even John Strawn, when he was trying to explain why he converted to Anglicanism back in 1802, he said, well, on the basic questions of theology, he didn't see any fundamental differences between the Church of England and the Presbyterians. And of course, Methodism, it was the daughter of the Church of England. So the urgency to create denominational Protestant schools simply was not there. It was, though, for the Catholics. In 1844, Ryerson became the superintendent of education for the whole colony, and he pushed for universal and mandatory public education, and a new public school act was passed in 1846. New board that he convened to oversee its implementation was amazingly ecumenical in character. If you look at the next slide, surprisingly, the very first chair of the Public Board of Education for the colony of Upper Canada was Michael Power, the Roman Catholic Bishop of Toronto, the first Roman Catholic Bishop of Toronto. And he was recommended for that position by, of all people, John Strawn. These men, as well as others, representing the various denominations that were spreading across the city and the colony, they were now directed with the renewal of public education. Now, you might well wonder, given the current double system of education that we have inherited in the province from those early days, how it was that bishop power fit into the equation. The data is a little sketchy, but from his letters, scholars believe that, like most of Upper Canada's citizens at the time, Bishop Power believed that there was more than just one way to educate a child. Yes, there were, of course, the common schools with a mixture of students from a variety of different faiths. That was great. There were also state-supported denominational schools, if a single religion dominated, say, in a specific township. There were also Sunday schools, which truly were educational vehicles at this period. And they were supportive, of course, for a doctrinal and moral instruction. The important point is that at this point, Catholics and all stripes of Protestants were working together in the 1840s on a single board to promote public education, an education that was still seen at that point that was both religious as well as an academic endeavor. How you got that across, that was the details were going to have to be worked out. But that it was important was agreed on by everyone. Now, if in those early decades the Anglican establishment in Toronto had labored under the faulty assumption that the privileged position it had enjoyed back in Toronto was going to continue here in the New World, they had now been rapidly disabused of that notion. The other main Protestant denominations certainly did everything in their power to challenge it, but they too had their own baggage that they brought with them to Toronto. Among the things that they brought with them were the tensions and divisions within their own faith communities that had been begun back in Britain or down the United States, and they just imported them here with them. If you look at the next slide, back in the old country, the Church of Scotland, it had already been splintering beginning in 1689. By the time that the Presbyterians started arriving in Toronto, they are a very, very divided group, with the main disagreement at that point, at any rate, being over the degree to which the British government should have a say in the appointment of clergy in the Scottish state church. Should the church be able to appoint its own ministers, or should the government say who will go into the churches? If you look at the next slide, these tensions, they erupted into a schism, yet another schism within the Church of Scotland in 1843, something called the Great Disruption, when 450 ministers broke away from the main church and established the Free Church, which operated independently. Now, interestingly, as I say, that's 1843. Why I raise it? If you look at the next slide, by the very next year, 1844, those divisions were already here in Toronto when a large group of Presbyterians, under the direction of the Reverend Robert Burns, they split away from the original St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, the one which is now down on King Street, and they founded Knox Presbyterian Church. It was a Free Presbyterian Church, the one that's now at Harvard and Spadina. It wouldn't be until 1861 that the Presbyterians could get their act together and reunite and become something like a Canadian Presbyterian Church. If you look at the next slide, the Methodists, well, they imported their own divisions into the colony, and that didn't help evangelization one bit. You can see there, if you can figure it out, that family tree, this was a very complex set of divisions that the Methodists go through. But Toronto, by the 1840s, it was home, 1840s, 1850s, it had already become home to members of the Methodist Episcopal Church, who arrived in large numbers after the War of 1812. It was home to the Wesleyan Methodist Church, the New Connection Methodist Church, the Bible Christians, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and the American Primitive Methodists. Doctrinally, as I say, this is the 1850s, doctrinally, there is no real difference between these Methodist groups. So why then did they remain separate in Toronto? Well, mainly, it seems, because of political reasons. The British Methodists, they tend to be conservatives in politics. The Primitive Methodists, They supported the radical left in the colony, while the members of the New Connection tried to straddle the fence, and the African Methodists, they just tried to stay out of everything. This would prove to be particularly difficult for Methodists in the years leading up to and immediately after the rebellion of 1837, given that a large number of Methodists supported the rebels. Now, as for the Catholic Church, it had its own issues in this town. You might think that its megalithic structure and efficient centralized government would have spared it the problems that the Protestants were experiencing, but that was not the case at all. In the early part of the 19th century, before there was a resident Catholic bishop in Toronto, the priests who came here lived and acted fairly independently. The Catholic clergy in Toronto were mostly Irish, which meant that they had been raised and formed in an Irish Catholic church that, remember, could not operate freely in the old country until 1829. Some of them were already here before that. The episcopal structure, with its firm guiding hand that we now find so familiar in the Catholic Church, that was just starting to take shape, but it was still a fairly new thing by the time these missionary priests found themselves in Toronto. They were very much used to acting independently without anyone telling them what to do. If you look at the next slide, the famous story is told of Father William O'Grady, who became the pastor of Toronto's First Catholic Church, St. Paul's, down on Queen Street in 1829. Now, O'Grady, by all accounts, was a charming man. He ingratiated himself beautifully with the Protestants here in town. He became a very close friend of the colony's lieutenant governor. He raised funds. He acquired land for the church in and around Toronto. He oversaw the building of the first Catholic school. He won the confidence of his bishop, Alexander Bactonel, who was down in Kingston. He got that confidence so well that he was made the bishop's vicar general for the western region of the colony. That relationship, however, soured quickly. At the end of 1831, St. Paul's church wardens complained to the bishop that Father O'Grady was inappropriately involved with a woman with whom he would ride around town in an open carriage for everyone to see. Other priests were maintaining that he was embezzling church funds. He was a known friend and associate of radicals like William Lyon Mackenzie. O'Grady was exonerated on all of these charges by Bishop Macdonnell, but the bishop thought, given everything that's going on, maybe it's a good idea to move him. And so he said, "You're going to Brockville, and you're going to take over the church there." O'Grady refused. He fired the church wardens. He then barricaded himself inside St. Paul's Church with some of his supporters. The bishop suspended him. He forbade any religious services to be held in St. Paul's. It was put under interdict, as they call it. And then the bishop actually had to go to court in order to regain control of the parish church, and he lost in the first trial. It took more than a year for the situation to get resolved, and even John Strawn intervened unsuccessfully to try and get O'Grady to change his behavior. This was a scandal that swept the city, and it interested people of all religious backgrounds. And O'Grady remained stubborn, and he appealed to the lieutenant governor, arguing, one of them was brilliant arguments, but stupid, but it was a brilliant argument, arguing to the lieutenant governor that after the conquest of Quebec by the English in 1759, surely control over Catholic priests in Canada had been transferred to the king, which of course was utter and complete nonsense. In May of 1833, O'Grady and his supporters in Toronto were excommunicated. He then went to Rome to appeal directly to the Pope, who wouldn't see him. He then went on to London to press his case with the Colonial Office. O'Grady finally gave up. He returned to Toronto, and he poured his efforts into the printing of a radical newspaper that he had founded. This story perhaps encapsulates for all of the denominations the Wild West character of Toronto and its environs in those early missionary years when the structures that could have provided order in each of the various denominations were lacking, either entirely or in part, or they were just beginning to emerge. It must have been an exciting, if a somewhat confusing time for everyone. Next week, we're going to look at how the transition happened from Toronto as a missionary territory to a city of established denominations. But if you look at the last slide, just to end tonight, let's look at the first hard statistics that we actually have from the year 1851-52, the very end of the missionary period, that shows us how the people of Toronto, then with a population of about 31,000, identified themselves according to religion. The Anglican community in Toronto was the largest, with 11,577. Roman Catholics by this time were now second, with 7,940. The Presbyterians, which broke down into 3 separate sects, were third, with a total of 4,544. Next were the Methodists, who broke down into 5, 4,123. There were 948 Baptists, 646 Congregationalists, 178 Unitarians, 40 Lutherans, 12 Quakers, 57 Jews, 23 Universalists, and 687 who didn't know what their religion was or didn't care. That really is an amazing diversity within a fairly small population, which may help us understand why one of Toronto's nicknames would be the City of Churches. It wasn't that Torontonians were more devout. It was just that they were so religiously divided, they needed more buildings. More on that next week when we look at the architectural history here in the city. For tonight, I think it's sufficient to remind us that with all of the challenges church planting faced during this missionary period, for Christians of all traditions from its very beginnings, Toronto well and truly was a meeting place. Thank you. That was longer than I anticipated, sorry. That was a little longer than I anticipated, sorry. If they want to ask it, sure. Anybody have a question? I know it's late, so.
Any questions? Yes.
Yes, good evening. First settlement, you said it's not far from here. We're on
Bobby Point.
Where's that?
So if you go up Jane Street, Jane and Annette, and where Annette goes off to the right, Bobby Point goes off to the left, and they're rather nice homes, to say the least. And that's the area where where it becomes a cliff. That's the area where the fort would have been.
Anybody else? Yes, sir. Just doing this for the sake of life.
You mentioned weirs as being important in the naming of Toronto. Wasn't there a weir at an Iroquois settlement on Bobby Point called Teyeyagon in the Humber River?
There was, and I mean, people have said, is it possible that that's where they get the name from? But because that early map has the name up on Lake Simcoe, and we know that the weir was there between, well, you can still see that picture is the archaeological remnants of it. But it's not impossible that you could have something like that and say, well, it's a Toronto as well, isn't it? Trees in the water. But most scholars seem to think, because of that error, that it was up in Couchiching, Simcoe area. Yeah, the native people were very big on those weirs.
One more question, anybody? Yes.
Father, I wonder what role the printing press might have had in these contests.
Well, as you can see, the Father O'Grady ended up having his own printing press. William Lyon Mackenzie was a great critic, of course. He had his own printing press here in Toronto, as I'm sure you know, and he used it to great advantage to criticize Anglican establishment, the family compact. There were other printers in town. Francis Collins, I think, was another one who had a printing press as well that helped make the case against the family compact and its religious interests in the control of the colony. The Methodist newspapers that start being published in the 1840s, 1850s are extremely important for being able to demonstrate the way in which particularly concerns about education and the religious overtones associated with education are going to fuel this. But one of the most interesting things, and we don't think of it now, that all of these newspapers, and there was a Catholic one eventually as well, all these newspapers, for example, on a Monday morning, would reprint the sermons that had been preached the day before from the various and sundry churches. It was a form of entertainment for people to see, which is unbelievable now, but it was a form of entertainment for people to see what was being preached in the churches. And that helped to be able to get a sense of what the various denominations were out and about, because you weren't necessarily going to the other churches to hear what was going on, but you could read about them. But next week I'm going to talk about it a little greater detail. There is also a remarkable fluidity among particularly the Protestant churches at this time. And it may be spurred on by things like the publications which they would read in the newspapers, and so they think, oh, maybe I should go over and see what's going on. My great-grandmother, I know for a fact from my grandmother, she held pews. You know how you had to have pew rents and you rented a pew? She had pews in the Presbyterian Church on Queen Street at Church. She had one at St. James Cathedral. She had one at Metropolitan Methodist. She had 4 different pew rents because that was what you did on Sunday. You went around and you know, you read about the guy in the paper last Sunday, and oh, he sounds good. I'm going to go to, you know, whatever Presbyterian church this week, even though she was a Catholic. So, well, she wasn't a very good Catholic. She was a terrible Catholic, in fact, but she was a terrible Catholic. At any rate, no, I think that the printing press is has a huge role in this, especially at the time of the rebellion of 1837 from the religious point of view.
Just a few points of clarification. In that period from 1844 to 1846, Egerton Ryerson leads the kind of struggle for a public board of education and then appoints Bishop Power. The very first, once that first public board over the entire colony, he taps Bishop Power to be the chair. But it's Strawn who has said, I think he would be a good choice to be the chair of this public board, which is very interesting. We're still unclear about Power and what he really feels about public education. He's very careful in what he writes in terms of his letters. He's very clear that he is a firm proponent of Catholic schools, but he sees those Catholic schools within the context of a public system. They're still not, the idea of 2 systems isn't really going to really get firmed up until the British North America Act in 1867. But Power is a huge advocate for the Catholic schools, but it seems within a public system. And you see, it's allowed for that. As long as you can get 20 kids, you can teach religion in that school. You can have a Catholic or an Anglican or a Baptist or whatever if you can get 20 kids. And was that a provision provided for by Egerton Ryerson?
Yes, in the Public School Act. Yeah.
And just one more thing, there were a recurring cholera epidemic
Yes.
at this time. Did the charitable impulse of the churches play a role in
That's lecture 3. Lecture 3 is, and that's where we talk about the Irish immigration and the cholera and the typhus and all that. Very, very much so. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. Really
Thank you.
appreciate it. Let's give him another.
Thank you. Next week is visually more interesting. It's church buildings and that kind of stuff.
This was great, and I didn't at all even notice that we went over time. It's great.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.